Hello, welcome to the CyberDogs Podcast. This is a podcast where we're going to talk about cybersecurity and politics, and we are literally surrounded by dogs, so you may hear some occasional barks if we fail to edit them out. My name is Zach. I'm making this podcast as part of a project for my cybersecurity class. I'm a computer science major at CU Boulder. I'm going to graduate this semester. I'm very excited. And I'm really excited about this project. I'm lucky enough to have a guest today. My guest is Phenix. Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a industry professional. I work for a major cloud hosting company. I've been in the industry for about 8 years, and happy to be here and talk with Zach a little bit about some cybersecurity stuff.
Yeah, and let me say Eric is understating himself a little bit. I think he's definitely an expert in all things computer science, and I'm really excited to hear his opinions on all this stuff today. So, Eric, so today I think what I want to focus on for this episode is a little bit about international cyber crime and cyber warfare. So an example would be one country like Israel, for example, planting some sort of malware into an Iranian nuclear site, and then allegedly, and causing some sort of explosion. Or it could be the U.S. cyber team performing what they call defensive forward hunt operations and doing essentially cyber seek and destroy missions. These are basically acts of theft or war between countries in cyberspace. So we're going to talk about the Biden administration and how they've been handling this so far. We'll dive a little bit back to the Trump administration. And we'll talk about some conceptual views and some politics. Let me just show you up here. One interesting tool that I found, or a resource that I found, was the Significant Cyber Incidents since 2006 tool from CSIS, which is a major U.S. cybersecurity organization. And we've actually talked about this before. So you can see here in the tool that we have a list of different cyber incidents where there were losses of more than $1 million. And let me just say, this list is very, very expansive. And you and I had some time off of the podcast to do a little bit of data collection and data analysis on this. And I would say one of the first things we picked up was just how much cybercrime has increased, and a little bit of that could be to do with the tracking, but we've definitely just seen a crazy amount of these events, and as I said before, these events only make the list if they're $1 million. And so one thing Eric was able to put together in about 5 minutes, which I'll put up on screen here, and I'll edit this in the podcast. So this is a web that Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Sure. So what we did here was some keyword analysis, mapping entities to common groups. So there's a number of entities that map to the United States. There's a number of keywords that would map to Russia, such as Russia, Russian, Kremlin, etc.
Right.
And we would look for records that contain groups of keywords, and we generated a knowledge graph between these. So in the 714 cybersecurity incidents in this data set, there were, for example, 5 between the UK and Canada. There were
here's Israel, Hamas. Yeah. There were 3.
Yep. Between the UK and Iran, there were 6.
Wow, look at Israel and Iran, 14. So Eric, this is thank you for helping me with this. This is amazing. I think that this will have a lot of further applications, and we can do some more experimenting now that we have this data. And this is definitely a very cool visualization. And let's just give our listeners a little bit of context here on some of these events. I know I said they were over $1 million, but let me just read off. So the head of the U.S. Cyber Command testified that the organization had conducted more than 24 operations to confront foreign threats ahead of the 2020 U.S. elections, including 11 forward hunt operations in 9 different countries. So that's one example of, and we'll get to this later, what the U.S. Cyber Command calls forward hunt. These are supposedly they're offensive operations that they call defensive in nature, which that sounds like a lot to kind of digest there, which is why this podcast is hopefully going to be very interesting. Let's go to another one. A group of Chinese hackers used Facebook to send malicious links to Uyghur activists, journalists, and dissidents located abroad. So you can see on this list, there's a whole range of different crimes going on, from spreading false information to violating confidentiality in some systems and stealing information, to denying availability through denial of service. There's a lot of different ways that states are interacting with each other through cyberspace that are very scary, to be frank. And we don't hear about all of these. And maybe you can touch on this, Eric, but I would say that in the mainstream news, you hear about things like SolarWinds, which was pretty big. You hear about the Israel attack. But there are a lot of significant incidents that the CSIS is reporting here. What do you think about this, Eric? Does this worry you at all?
So one of the most interesting things about this is not only is the frequency of these reported attacks increasing, but also the sophistication of them. Earlier in 2006, 2007, the reports were, a single network was compromised and 20,000 documents might have gotten leaked. But now there are reports of state-sponsored actors doing malicious programming and targeted attacks against specific foreign entities. And that, I think, that growth in sophistication and targeting just shows that the next wave of warfare is going to be cyber in nature.
Right, and I think that's a really good point. And I think that's actually a great segue into politics. So we have the frequency of these big attacks increasing. We have the complexity of the attacks increasing, which, as a side note, to a politician, that just means any solution is probably going to cost more money. But yeah, let's talk about politics. So we know that there are some, at least in nature, there are some apolitical institutions, the CIA, the NSA, the Department of Defense, where there's some continuity in terms of cyber policy. So meaning when Trump gets voted out of office or when Obama gets voted out of office, there's not a exceedingly large shift in that policy. And so we'll kind of touch on that policy in a little bit. But first, I actually would like to talk about kind of the leadership, because leadership is important, I would say. Companies do hire chief information security officers, things like that. So I think we'll kind of stick to just kind of a Biden-Trump conversation, and we'll try to keep it brief. But essentially what I'm trying to figure out is, what is the shift that's happening right now in the U.S. cyber policy? Because like I just said, there's continuity in some areas, but in some areas there's a shift. So just a little bit of background and the way I see things. With Trump, you kind of had a little bit of back and forth on a lot of policies. Trump did do some questionable things related to cybersecurity. He publicly encouraged hacking in some people's views when he told the Russians that they should find Hillary's emails. He said, China, if you're listening, you should hack this or hack that. You can Google it if you want the specifics. But he didn't seem to take the cybercrime as seriously, at least publicly, as I've heard from Biden right now. The other thing that Trump did that really concerned me was he fired Chris Krebs, who was the head of CISA, and essentially he fired him after he came out and said that the election was secure. Do you remember this, Eric?
Yes.
Okay. So I would say that was probably the extent of Trump's cyber career. I would say most of the other things during his administration were probably handled by these other institutions, and I was just largely disappointed by those actions. Biden has, I would say, he's come out and he has made cybersecurity a very central part of his policy from the very beginning. His first day in office on January 20th, he announced the American Rescue Plan, which was a very large bill related to COVID, but it had a lot of specifics in it about cybersecurity. One of the sections, modernize federal information technology to protect against future cyber attacks. So, and there's about 4 bullets in here. Funding an additional $690 million to CISA, $300 million, $200 million to another couple organizations, $9 billion investment for a major new IT and cybersecurity shared services CISA project. So from day one, there was funding, and then another thing that we can point to with Biden just in his first year would be the action that he took against the Russians for the SolarWinds attack. And so if we look, I sent you this article, so I'm sure that you've already read it, but or this fact sheet. So this was actually very recent, April 15th, imposing costs for harmful foreign activities by the Russian government. So the Biden administration, what they did is they said, we have enough evidence that proves that this was state-sponsored hacking, and we are going to take economic in nature actions. So that they were financial sanctions against the Russians, but this is a direct action for a hack. So that's kind of the rundown of how I see things. Biden is a new presidency. Trump didn't delve in much. I'm wondering, what do you think about the few things that Biden did so far, and also do you think that anything Trump did was, is going to come back to bite us as overtly harmful, or was, really not that big of a deal now?
So my general view is that while nice to have, the executive branch's policies aren't long-lasting enough to be that important. If between 2 8-year administrations we can do a complete 180 on good cybersecurity policy, what's to stop the next president from undoing everything that Biden does? What really worries me is our long-term forms of legislation are so cumbersome to enact and so slow from certain obstructionism in the House and Senate by certain parties that real-time, fast-paced reform, which we need, just won't happen in time.
Yes, I definitely see your point there, and I agree, and things I've learned in this class would also agree with that point. For my midterm project, I interviewed an industry professional, and he just talked about the sheer pace of the industry. There's new technologies, new hacks. There's just so many new things popping up, and there's just such a lack of knowledgeable people out there that it does really scare me for a lot of the reasons that you were talking about. But that's, again, you're great at segueing. So really, one important thing to look at is like I said, more of the apolitical actors. So what is the DoD doing? What is the NSA doing? What is the CIA doing? Obviously, there's a lot of secrecy surrounding a lot of those things, but we do have some insight. We do know that back in 2015, here's an NPR article about how the U.S. hacked ISIS. We revealed some very offensive in nature operations that the NSA, CIA, and others helped coordinate against ISIS. But we also have, we showed before, that cyber events list with some public releases by the U.S. And we know about, do you want me to give you a little background on these hunt forward operations?
I read the article.
You read the article? Okay. So we've got these hunt forward operations, and
I think there was another one you sent me about the myth of cyber offense. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I want to get into next. So NSA, CIA, like I said, very secretive. We know some things. DoD is a little bit more transparent from what I've read with their press briefings about, like I said, these forward hunt operations and releasing that information. So what I've gathered from these sources is that we have a policy that is, I touched on this before, it's the goal is defensive, but we are taking offensive actions, or at least the stated goal is defensive. And so there's this debate as to not just ethically, but practically, when you escalate in the cyberspace, whether or not that begets more escalation. So if Israel does this major attack to Iran and explodes all these nuclear reactors, does that increase the chances of Iran wanting to do attacks like that? When the U.S. does forward hunt operations, does that strengthen the foreign security teams that they're trying to crush? So I think what this article that you brought up by the Cato Institute, The Myth of Cyber Offense, The Case for Restraint, it's really interesting, and it delves into this stuff about, is an eye for an eye the way that we're going in cyberspace? Is there a way to be more defensive? And so, yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on this and maybe discuss, this kind of offensive versus defensive posturing a little bit.
Yeah, so one of the things that comes to mind with that question is the idea of asymmetric response. Of we might have done this offensive cybersecurity program, and the response to it might not be a cyber arms race. It might just be a geopolitical or military arms race. So our attacks versus ISIS may have temporarily destabilized them, but that might have also invigorated them to do other military operations against us, poking the bear, so to speak. So incident by incident, you kind of have to analyze it, is sort of what you're saying? From a defensive posturing, I think one of the things we should do is enforce, much higher cybersecurity requirements on companies that want to do business with Americans' data, with PII, with credit card information. I don't think that current regulatory policies for companies or government entities go far enough in that regard.
That's a very interesting point. And I think that's a fascinating topic. Should the government require some minimum baseline standard of, so let's say if I have PII, what's considered PII of over a certain amount of users, am I required to meet certain standards? And this goes on all sorts of political lines, right? Big government, small government, regulation, no regulation. I personally think that this could be good regulation. I think that this also depends if you're the U.S. government, right, and you're trying to figure out, okay, I'm probably going to have to pay for all this cybercrime eventually. How do I want to pay for it, right? Do I want to pay a little bit up front and subsidize some of these companies with legacy systems, right, and ask for some minimum cyber. I think if the government says, hey, we need these minimum standards, obviously there has to be a transition period. There's got to be help for the companies, right? Do you agree with that? Is it, in principle, maybe you don't. No.
No. A company, in my view, is not a person, and there can be a minimum set of requirements that they have to meet in order to do business. The same way that you have to permit a new building to make sure it's safe for its occupants, you should have to permit and meet the regulatory requirements of operating a data business to make sure that your customers' data is safe.
I agree with that, but let's say the permitting laws change and all of a sudden you're in violation of the new law. Should you have some time or should you have some help to get to that new place? I mean, I guess the point
going with that analogy, the way that buildings would work is there would be a grace period. Some like older buildings might be grandfathered in for time periods. But if the business ever changes, they would have to reapply for permits. But it's not a perfect example.
Okay. But you agree that there would have to be something like that in nature.
Yeah.
Right. Because
generally, if we look at things like deprecating security standards, like TLS 1.1, moving to newer versions of our encryption standards, those have generally been run by industry consensus rather than a government policy saying the whole industry needs to do this on this date.
And you think the nudge from the government would be helpful and not overly cumbersome for the industry as a whole?
Define overly cumbersome for the industry as a whole. Because companies and the people that pay for teams of developers to do this will say that it is overly cumbersome because it is going to affect their profit margins. And the key is to not let it be up to the people who are trying to make money off of our data.
No, I don't mean if it was their decision. I mean, they're already implementing it in a perfect world. You're predicting how cumbersome it will be, essentially. But I think, so that's a good point. The government might as well take these preventative actions, right? If they think that there's that big of a risk on the tail end of bad things happening. But you could also make an argument on the other side, right? You could say more of a Wild West argument, I would call it, where you would basically say that's a company, they're the private sector, they do what they want. You, as a citizen, you are the one that gave them your information. You choose what to do with your information. And if they get hacked, let them pay the consequences. Should the government do less? Should the government put more of the onus on the companies?
So if you go to a grocery store and you buy a food product, you can assume safely that product is edible and non-toxic. If you sign up for a company and you give them your data, you should, in the United States at least, be able to assume that your data will be safe with them.
I'm sure you have more to go on, but this is in a perfect world, correct? Not based off of when I sign up for something now, I just assume that my data is probably not safe, right? But in a perfect world, yes, in the United States, you should be able to sign up for stuff and assume that your data is safe.
Buyer beware policies are generally bad for consumers. The amount of research that you would have to do into a company's potentially trade secret method of handling your data. So in some ways you might not be able to figure out where your data will go once you sign up with a company, because it might either be buried in mountains of legalese with overly vague statements like, we may or may not share your data with third-party entities. Okay, well, that doesn't help me. What I think the United States could really benefit from would be doing something like a consumer bill of rights for their data, and implement policies similar to GDPR, like in Europe, where every company has to implement systems that allow you to control your data with each company. So if
yes,
like for instance, did you know that Equifax had all your data before the Equifax data breach? Did you think about it actively?
I personally did, but potentially a lot of people did not.
When did you sign up for Equifax to have all of your data? Did you hand it to them?
When I was born, I suppose. But so I think that essentially what you're getting at is it's such a good idea because it kind of has the added benefit of improving our cybersecurity as a nation, but to me the primary benefit of that, and I think to a lot of other people, is just it's more of an ideological thing. I should be in control of my data. I mean, it's a safety thing, obviously, but I think a lot of people can get behind that just because they don't want they want companies that have their data to have some minimum standards, right? I definitely personally think that's true, and yeah, I think that's a great point. And the CyberDogs podcast has just had its first official dog interruption. My dog is crying and he's distracted me incredibly from what we're talking about. So just to kind of go a little bit backwards, so we were talking about the myth of the cyber offense, the case for restraint. We're talking about the U.S. policy. And essentially what Eric and I have discussed so far is that some of the money that we're spending in some of these offensive operations, probably good, but one of the real issues is that we have a lot of these companies in the U.S., based in the U.S., or companies that do business in the U.S., that just have no standards, no minimum cybersecurity standards that they have to meet in order to do business or to be incorporated here or anything. And we discussed kind of how there could be a good approach to some government regulation that could require that. Maybe not everyone would be happy about it, but we think that we could just rip that Band-Aid off because it's going to have to happen eventually, right? And we also think that's something that could potentially prevent far worse consequences in the end, right? So I think Eric, I mean, thanks for doing this. Everything you said was very, very insightful, and I learned a lot from you, and I just hope that I can keep on learning and understand this stuff as good as you someday. So
you'll be teaching me someday, Zach.
Yeah, well, thank you.